Well, I'm going to call the meeting to order at this time. Welcome, everybody. Good to see everyone. And you can't be missed down there, Amy.
In my bright orange.
And I'd say Michael can't be missed either tonight. So it's not Pink Floyd. Help me out.
Declan McKenna.
Okay.
Who is
that
it?
shows how out of it I am.
Who is it, Michael?
The British band, Declan McKenna.
I like it. That pizzazz. All right, we're going to open with prayer tonight. Swam.
Okay, well, thank you, Jim. Can we bow our heads, please? Our dear Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for this opportunity that we can gather together and go about the business of Georgetown Township. We pray for your wisdom, and please be with all of us, Lord, as we look carefully at the business of our people. Please keep our citizens safe, and we pray for our first responders, and we pray for all the good people here at Georgetown Township that do a wonderful job. We pray for our world leaders, and we pray for our national leaders. Please give them wisdom. Thank you for your continued blessing. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, son. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right, let the record reflect that all members are present this evening. Item 5 is approval of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve tonight's agenda?
So moved.
Support.
Supported. Discussion. Hearing none. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, our agenda is passed. Item 6, communication letters and reports received for information. Item number 7 is our initial public comment period. Is there anyone from the public here tonight that wishes to address any of the items on our agenda this evening? There will be a second public comment period later for anything you wish. Is there anyone who wishes to address tonight's agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll close that first public comment period. We'll move on to item number 8, the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve tonight's consent agenda?
So moved.
Support.
All right, discussion, debate? Nothing? All right. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Item 8 is carried. At this point, I'm going to introduce our clerk, who needs no introduction, I think, among us, but maybe for those who are here, Justin Roebuck. Justin, we're grateful that you come tonight, and you're going to talk to us, address us about the new 9-day voting requirements that were voted in as part of Proposal 2 last year. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate you guys having me out and entertaining this discussion. I know this is an important issue that we've been working with our local clerks and the election administration community on for quite a while here. And definitely a lot of changes have been implemented essentially by this constitutional proposal that passed in November of 2022. And actually Proposal 22.2 changed quite a bit of things regarding election law. I'm going to specifically just hone in tonight on the early voting portion of that because obviously that's what we're here to talk about, our proposed plan for implementing early voting wide. So I thought what I would do is just briefly cover the essentials of the proposal itself.
Before you do, what we voted either for or against this past year, of course, couldn't have contained everything that we're now going to see you talk about implementing, right? The link between what was voted on and what has actually been implemented, is that filled in by the legislature or who's?
Yeah, that's a great question. And basically you're right. Yeah, so implementing legislation is kind of filled in the gaps of, the constitutional requirement is the structural framework, and essentially the implementation legislation has to, direct the Secretary of State and county and local clerks as to how exactly we navigate doing what the voters essentially told us to do.
Yeah, and it's not, and again, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but it's not obviously as clear as all that in what the voters are asked to vote upon. So the party in charge gets a little more leeway, I would think, in terms of the interpretation of what passed and how it's implemented.
Yeah, I think in certain ways, and I try to cover some of the implementation pieces versus the actual constitutional piece as well. But yeah, there's certainly those elements, right? Because the leadership that's currently in Lansing was supportive of the proposal, and so there's this, impetus on their part to essentially, fulfill the obligations that are incurred basically by the state due to the passage of the proposal. So we've definitely been walking through that legislative piece and finally have gotten a little bit of resolution on that, so that's encouraging.
Okay.
But this here is essentially what the Constitution says about early voting now that Proposal 2 has passed. So it creates essentially a right to a minimum of 9 days of early voting in the state constitution. So for every state or federal election, which is basically any election where a state candidate or federal candidate is on the ballot, which amounts to almost always our typical even year elections, beginning next year with the presidential preference primary, then the state primary in August, and then the November general presidential election in November. So this is essentially what we would call a polling place style of voting. So sometimes when people say they voted early now, that's a little bit confused with, you can certainly walk into the township office today, fill out an absentee ballot, put that in an envelope, hand it back to the clerk. That gets counted on election day. And in effect, you've voted early. But true early voting, as it's implemented in almost every other state, is essentially a polling place style where you walk in, check in, you get handed a ballot, and then you put that ballot in a tabulator, just like you would in a precinct. No early reporting of any results. So naturally, the equipment itself is programmed not to release any results or not to be able to essentially accumulate results until after the polls close on election night. And the Constitution actually specifically provided for municipalities to contract for these services with county government or with other municipalities where they were connected, essentially physically, geographically connected. So that's sort of the...
Two questions, Justin.
Yeah.
It says minimum 90 days. So if I'm in a city or township and I want 30 days or 45 for my electorate, should that be passed then within a city or a township to make it as
correct
county, right?
Wow.
The implementing legislation actually outlined the maximum number of days of early voting, which there are some limitations on maximum days because of the physical constraints of when filing deadlines are, when ballots are available, when election officials can be trained and prepared essentially to administer an election. And so what the legislature decided on with PA 81 of 2023, which was signed by the governor in late June, essentially establishes a maximum number of 29 days for early voting that municipalities can decide. And municipalities can also decide to hold early voting in an election that is not a state or federal election. Maybe it's a city holding a city election and they decide, well, we're going to do that in the off year. We're also going to offer early voting. So amongst other things that the implementing legislation kind of built that framework around was a requirement for the Secretary of State to provide the adequate resources that we would need to ensure the security of the voter file in a vote center model. So in other words, if you're voting early and you come in, we need some mechanism to ensure that you don't go to another vote center or drop off an absentee ballot or come in on election day. And we have some semblance of that right now with our same-day registration process, which happens in the local clerk's office here. Voters come in and they have to provide an ID. They have to have a driver license number in the database in the state of Michigan, and then the local clerk looks that voter up and can see where, if they've registered before, where that was and when that was. And so it's a similar sort of model, but the Secretary of State's been given the directive to essentially build that out for vote centers.
I think you said earlier that they're tabulated. That's always, it seems to have been the problem with the patchwork quilt around the country the last few years of early voting is, we can't give you results on election night because so many people voted early and they can't count them until after the vote is closed, and it takes us, days. People wonder what's going on during those days. Will tabulating, or that requirement that they be tabulated as they're submitted, tamp down on the possibility that we have these, multiple days after an election ends that you don't know who won?
I certainly hope so. And I think, so with that tabulation factor, that is largely the absentee ballot population, right? So when people mail in their ballots, many states have many different rules on this. For example, Pennsylvania, until last year, the state of Pennsylvania required that absentee ballots not be counted until after the polls close. And so once the polls close and everyone's done voting on election night, that's when absentee ballots could begin to be counted in Pennsylvania. Of course, COVID and the 2020 election and the increase of absentee ballots has really kind of put a spotlight on some of the flaws in the timing mechanism of counting absentee ballots. This is a little bit different in early voting because the voter is doing that workflow. The voter is actually checking in, getting their ballot, and putting it through the tabulator. And so it's tabulated just like it is on election day when the voter casts it.
Yeah.
So it's a much quicker turnaround in terms of getting the results. We just have to allow the process.
So theoretically, even though we've expanded the time in which people can vote, the results should not be delayed.
Correct.
As a result of this new voting procedure.
Correct. Yeah, because of that workflow and because we have the Monday prior to the election, which we'll talk about in a minute as well, but so it's 9 days prior to election outside of that Monday. So it begins on the Saturday prior to the election. Look at Amber for that. It's the Saturday prior to election all the way through to the Monday prior. And so on that Monday, there's, reconciling and balancing of the books that has to occur as it does every day of the early voting, and then they get tabulated on election night.
And now we must staff on a Sunday voting, correct?
Correct.
Okay, that'll be an interesting court challenge, I suppose, in Hamtramck or who knows where, right? Where people say that's not going to fly on a particular holy day or a...
Not used to that. But as a constitutional requirement. Now that is specifically in the Constitution. 9 days.
Wow.
So, as we talked about, municipalities conducting the hours, those are sort of established in that framework of the legislation. Also prescribing security measures that have to be followed by election officials when it comes to the actual setup of early voting locations, the securing of the tabulators and electronic voting equipment, the ballots themselves have to be secured, and the law requires that. Establishing a process for entering into those county and municipal agreements. That's what the legislation sort of built out a framework for that. Also requires the county clerk participating in an agreement to submit an early voting plan to the Secretary of State. We have until November 25, I believe, to do that to the Secretary of State's office before the presidential preference primary next year. It also requires a voter communication plan, and that is addressed in our early voting proposal here as well, but there's a specific requirement in the statute to have a communication plan to let voters know that this even exists. Because I don't know about your neighbors, but I don't think my neighbors even know yet that this is happening. So this is a little bit of what we are looking for in a collaborative plan, and really we started this conversation very early with our local clerks. We had a meeting actually in October of 2022. We kind of called it the what if meeting. So what if this happens? Proposal 2. How do we prepare for it? How do we best equip our election administration community to manage a process that's really kind of a watershed change in our election legislation? So this is kind of based out of months of conversations we've had with our clerks, as well as with the Department of Strategic Impact with Ottawa County, which has been really helpful at crunching some numbers and looking at, modeling of voters and data. Quite a bit of conversation that we've had. So the plan is essentially to engage the county clerk staff to implement early voting in a county-wide system that includes sort of a universal voter communication plan, also setting up and staffing of all of the early vote center locations. It establishes a 2-year agreement, and that 2-year agreement is set forth in the law, so it has to be 2 years. It can't be 1, it can't be 5, it has to be a 2-year agreement. But this agreement includes one full-time early voting coordinator position at the county level. Basically, this position would manage the process of executing early voting for all of our municipalities. We believe that the most cost-effective, secure model for this is to utilize a vote center model, which is essentially, when you look at an early voting model and the way that other states do early voting, it is a vote center model. So vote centers look different than our typical precincts that we see on election day. When you're used to voting on election day, we typically go to a church in our neighborhood or a school maybe, fire barn, something like that that's close by. Relatively small space because of the number of registered voters that attend that precinct. Vote center model looks a little bit different. It's a convenient location for voters. It's accessible near a highway or a place where people are shopping or eating out or on their way to work. It's a model where you
a college campus?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think if it's accessible enough, something like that would certainly work. And it's also a place where voters from multiple jurisdictions within the county could participate. So you don't have to live right here in Georgetown if you're voting at a vote center in Georgetown. And that's why that, security mechanism, Secretary of State and the voter file is so important. And that's what we see other states doing as well. Michigan's very interesting because it's a very decentralized state for election administration. We have city and township governments that are essentially, responsible. The clerk of that township is responsible for elections. And we haven't really seen a national example of early voting in a decentralized system. So you're sort of laying over this more centralized process on top of a decentralized process, which is challenging. The cost as well would be shared amongst all 23 local jurisdictions based on the number of registered voters within the jurisdiction. And it's also shared within the jurisdictions and the county. We'll get to that in just a second. We've identified, and again, we have not finalized any of these locations because of the fact that we have to finalize the agreements first. But we have identified some key locations within the county where we think it makes sense to put a vote center. Obviously here, the Georgetown Township building and the facilities here, we think it's a great central location. We think it's a great opportunity for the Georgetown residents to obviously participate in a very convenient way, but also central to a lot of other things, central to folks that are out maybe in Blendon and Jamestown Townships and obviously the city of Hudsonville. Holland, we've been in conversation with the Grand Rapids Community College campus there, the Lakeshore campus that's in the old Lakeshore Mall, which again is in that 31 corridor, kind of central to where a lot of people are traveling to eat or shop or work. Grand Haven Township, we're looking at a couple of options in the Grand Haven Township area, as well as the Crockery Township Hall there north of the river, which is kind of a central location for folks who live in a little bit of the more rural parts of Ottawa County to be able to access early voting center there in their communities as well. So what does the agreement really look like in terms of the responsibilities? The county clerk, under the responsibilities of the agreement, would be in charge of the logistical operation of early voting centers, including securing the location, the rental agreements, the hiring, training, scheduling of election inspectors for early voting. We're estimating roughly 50 election inspectors for this process. And by the way, I didn't mention, but our agreement currently, in this 2-year agreement, calls for the 9-day required time frame. So that is the 9-day minimum, 8 hours per day, leading into every election, every federal election next year. And also the county is responsible for purchasing, securing the equipment and supplies, as well as programming all of the election equipment. Also implementing the countywide voter communication plan. So the local clerk would be responsible under the agreement for providing a list of election worker contact information so that we could utilize this in potential recruitment of election inspectors. I think it's really important for us to have experienced folks doing this first rollout. And so we have 23 jurisdictions, over 1,100 election workers in the county. We have a great pool of resources. And our local clerks have been very, very willing to offer that assistance in the process. Also agreeing to provide on-site supervision on a rotating basis amongst our 23 jurisdictions at each of the 4 locations. And the implementing legislation gives this as an option specifically, and we felt like it was an important requirement to put in the agreement because we do think it's important for local clerks to have a presence and a voice in this process. We are a decentralized election administration process. This isn't a county run election world. This is a collaborative environment where we are coming together to supervise an operation. And so we want to help on the logistics side, but we also want to make sure that we have the voice of our local clerks present in each of these locations. And also providing for the purchase and supply of precinct test ballots that are used in the conduct of testing of equipment, which is pretty much in keeping with what we do now for the testing of election equipment as well. This is how the breakdown looks in terms of the cost. So we are looking at the county taking up a substantial portion of the cost of the early voting project, which is really not at all required by the constitutional language of the implementing legislation, but it's something that we feel strongly that we need to support. And this is a collaborative effort, and we want to show good faith in that. The purchase of election equipment and 50% of equipment maintenance ongoing. So this is actually in keeping with exactly what we have now. So since 1946, Ottawa County has owned the election equipment that is used in our local jurisdictions. The most recent agreement was 2017, and that's where we did this equipment purchase from the county, but then a 50-50 split with municipal governments. And so this would remain in place basically for early voting equipment. And then the funding of this early voting coordinator salary and benefit costs, essentially 75% of those costs in year 2 would be picked up by the county. The reason for that is we have felt strongly, and this is based on a lot of the conversations we've had with our local clerks as well, this isn't really a position we want to sort of hire every couple of years on a temporary basis. This is somebody we need to have institutional knowledge. We need to hire a professional who's experienced and capable of running an operation like this. We're really looking to recruit somebody on the clerk side of things who, this is what our clerks do, and we would love to be able to have this person as a stable factor in the process. And so the county really, we want to have that buy-in. 75%, basically the reason for that is that, on the other 25%, we're really essentially preparing for an election. For example, in February, we're starting the preparations for February primary in October. So that work will go on through the primary election, presidential primary, the state primary, the general election. We have the certification, potential recounts, the post-election audit process. A lot of times that winds up in January of the following year. Once most people have forgotten who the president and vice president are, we are still working on the budget. So that's sort of the reasoning for that. The material cost for the local unit side, the material cost of the vote center operation, so the actual supplies that will be needed to carry out the early voting process, 50% of the maintenance, of course, the 100% of early voting coordinator salary in year 1 of the agreement, and then 25% year 2, and then the election worker and temporary staff costs, which actually represents a pretty substantial savings when you're pooling the cost of 50 election workers together over 23 local jurisdictions. So this is roughly what we have as the cost distribution. So year 1 of the agreement would essentially start October 1, which is the county's fiscal year of this year. The reason for that heavy amount is basically an 80-20 split in terms of the cost year over year, and it's because in that implementation year we have a lot of needs, right? We have to buy the structural things that are required, security cages for ballots and tabulators, the actual equipment itself, the onboarding of the full-time employee and so forth. Year 2 is lower cost, the county picking up a little bit more in that year just because of the way the FTE salary breaks down there. So again, this is basically, our reasoning as we've come up with this together as a team, and I do want to stress this was essentially, and I'm pretty sure, I'm guessing Amber was there, I'm not sure, in that first meeting where I literally just said to our clerks, what can we do to keep you from retiring? This is a real strain on election administration, and the reality is we need our good election administrators to stay, and they need support to do that. They need support from their local communities. They need support from the county, and we believe this is cost efficient. When you look at the breakdown here, we're looking at approximately $769,000 total cost. But that's to run 9 days of early voting and 3 elections, 8 hours a day for 230,000 voters all next year. And I think that's actually a pretty reasonable cost when you look at the cost of early voting. Not only what it looks like in other states, it's an expensive proposition, but also what it's looked like as our municipalities have done the math and tried to say, well, this is probably what we really need in order to do this well. We're looking at a conservative estimate as we've gathered data, and I know that you guys have put together your own data as well, but a conservative estimate is we're saving Ottawa County taxpayers roughly $600,000 over the course of this agreement, which is almost half of the project cost. And so I think that's a good argument for it. I also think security is really, really important in this endeavor because we are in a position now where if every municipality were to do this on their own, there are many who do have the resources to potentially just keep it in-house in a township hall or in a city hall. There are quite a few who do not. And so we'd be looking at least 15 separate locations outside of the township hall where election equipment, ballots, poll books have to be stored securely in multiple locations over multiple days. And I think, when we look at a process of having 4 locations, uniform training, uniform equipment, uniform processes for securing our product, essentially, that was something that our clerks walked away with as well, thinking this is a better and more secure possibility. It's also customer focused. I think, Jim, as you touched on earlier, the idea that we can have a very divergent possibilities across municipalities in terms of when early voting occurs and how it occurs. So the hours can be set differently as well as the number of days. And so you could be voting, have the option to vote 9 days early. If your neighbor lives across the street in a different jurisdiction, maybe they would have 20 days of early voting at differing hours. This, to me, seems like a communication challenge, to say the least, but also a concern of the equality issue when it comes to opening up the voting process for voters on an equal basis. And so I think this is a great way to solve that problem, at least at the local level here in Ottawa County, by saying to all of our voters, here's where you're going to go. These are the locations. These are the times. They're all uniform times. We can communicate that in a very streamlined and uniform message, and I think that helps. The last thing I will say is perhaps the most important thing financially, and that is we have put all this together, and all the cost analysis has been put together without assuming state funding, and we know that the state will come in fund a significant portion of this project. The governor appropriated, so there's 2 budget line items that were signed by Governor Whitmer in June. One is a $24 million appropriation for the implementation of early voting statewide, and another is specifically a $30 million appropriation to incentivize county involvement in the early voting project. And basically, I think the state leadership recognizes the expenses that can be incurred. When you're looking at equipment expenses alone, we have 1,500 local jurisdictions, right, in the state of Michigan. We have 83 counties. And so there is real cost benefit here for the state to help incentivize that county involvement. And a lot of my colleagues are doing this in varying different ways, from counties who are helping in a small way in certain pockets counties who are doing the entire project as well. So
would that be in perpetuity, or that would just, this is going to cover the first couple of years, and then you're going to have the next governor or legislature decide to award money in the future as well?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like a statute that says the state must.
There is not. In fact, the constitutional language that passed, there were actually a couple of specific things stated in the constitutional language that required the state to pay for. One was postage on ballots. So the return absentee ballot is now required, the state is required to reimburse the local jurisdiction for return postage. The other are drop boxes. So the state's required to fund the drop box purchase, but not early voting, which is clearly the biggest financial lift of anything in that proposal. And that literally just kind of left the burden to the municipal government.
And drop boxes, that's something entirely different from
right
here. Okay.
Still contained in that one constitutional proposal, but different than this project that we're working on.
And the money that is allocated, how will it be allocated? Will it be allocated based on the county population, or will it be allocated based on need? And
so that is the key and critical question that we are waiting to find out. We received on Friday, no time to spare. We received on Friday afternoon a survey from the Bureau of Elections. They gave us 4 days to fill it out. And luckily we had all the information because we've been planning this for 6 months, so we knew exactly what they were asking for, but they essentially are breaking it down into a couple of different categories. Election worker cost, the cost of the polling locations themselves, the cost of the electronic poll books that are going to need to be used in the different sites, and the cost of the equipment as well. And then they asked for additional information on costs. And so we've actually been sharing with the Bureau of Elections staff, as well as some colleagues of mine from around the state, the work that we've been doing internally with a group of our clerks representing big and small and medium-sized jurisdictions. Amber has been a part of that ongoing work group, kind of discussing cost analysis. So we know sort of the buckets that the state is looking at to say, we want to use this grant funding to fund these portions. But you're right, it is definitely a one-time deal currently. I mean, depending on what it looks like. But there's obviously some sunk costs that will be not ongoing costs either. Electronic poll books and election equipment and some of the other material equipment, like the security devices that we need to seal things up within the early voting center location. Those are things we won't have to continue buying. That will hopefully get some help.
Sounds like their inquiry is more population-based. If you're talking about the cost of these various poll books and the like, and you say, well, the more people you have, the more needs you have, the more cost there is. And presumably, whether I'm on the east side or the west side, I can obtain these pieces of equipment for a comparable cost. So I would think population is going to be the driving factor in how much each county's cost is. And it seems you're so capable and so on top of it. I mean, you're leading other counties and the like with it. Just from past experience, not sure entirely, but I know here that we feel sometimes penalized in Georgetown for efficiency. And those that are less efficient are more apt to get, help and funding. I can't help but think that it'll be the case here as well.
I completely agree. It's a really challenging, as you guys know, and I think we have experienced this at different levels of the county as well, right, in the past. It's a fine line to walk, and particularly when you're looking at such a major project affecting every one of our voters in some way next year. How do we go about planning this well, while also recognizing that we do need that? I mean, why wouldn't we need the help and the funding if the funding is available? But we definitely felt it was important to err on the side of preparation and planning. Particularly with the hiring of this full-time person, we want that person to be able to hit the ground running this fall, essentially, to be able to recruit and schedule and implement the election workers where they need to go and get that hiring process taken care of, and then the training piece. We're also waiting on the state of Michigan for training guidance as we're kind of ready to hit the ground running with our training manuals for early voting.
Justin, I have a question for you. You spoke of communication. Who is doing all the communication to tell all the voters where these early voting locations are? And you mentioned also that they have to be staffed on a Sunday.
Yeah, correct.
And
You have to go to their house, take their hand, pick them up in your car, bring them to the voting spot, because,
that's how it's going
hate
to
to
go.
say it, but this is the most complicated thing I've ever seen in my life. But
People are going to be confused as to where they go and who's telling them where you go. Because people from Blendon can come here and vote in an early voting.
Yep, only in an early voting center.
Right.
Right. But on election day, it's basically status quo. It's the same as you would have normally done.
Right.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think.
Are we going to get a million phone calls for Amber, wondering where do I go? And
yep, I think part of our communications plan, which is still being developed in the process, we're working with a task force of basically advisors right now on the local clerk side. And again, I so appreciate Amber's willingness to step up and say, I'll help weigh in on some of these, but the communication needs to happen because a couple of things, voters need to know about it. This is something that is in our state constitution now, and it's something that they have access to. But B, the inundation of questions at exactly the wrong time, right, for our local clerks as they prepare for the election, to be hit with multiple voter questions of people just not sure what the process looks like. So we need to be aggressive in that communication plan.
So you don't know you don't really have a plan yet, or you don't have somebody in place that says we're going to email, we're going to.
Oh yeah, I think we're working very hard on that communication plan, and I feel very confident that we'll have a pretty robust communication plan, given the limited dollars that we have to spend, and that's something that we would take grant dollars from the state from as well. I think, taking public dollars, the state's money that they've appropriated specifically for a project like this, it's important to be able to use for communicating. But the second part of your question, on the Sunday issue, that was definitely something that frustrated, I think, a lot of us.
Can there be different hours on Sunday or not?
There is fluctuation in the ability that we have to set the hours. We have to have 8 hours a day. And we have to be open on those days. So it would be the second Saturday prior to any election, federal election. So all the way through that Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then Monday before the election is a day to sort of reset for our clerks to then move into election day.
Okay.
I do appreciate your work on this. I think you're ahead of the curve. But I look at the system and I think this, a guy like you is very organized, and I appreciate that, but I don't see that in all the townships and all the counties. This thing is so complicated, and not having everything even set up yet. This is nuts.
It is a challenge. I don't think I disagree.
What could go wrong?
Almost good by design.
I use the word nightmare.
Well, so do school millages fall underneath the same law?
No, actually. So
Imagine that.
Constitution says, at a minimum, these are the minimum requirements, the 9 days, the federal and state elections. The implementing legislation says, you can decide. So even in this environment, say every jurisdiction signs on to this proposed plan, which, it's looking positive, but say every jurisdiction's here in the plan, and then you guys decide to say, you know what, Jonathan's having a school election, we're going to do early voting for a May off year. You could do that. And that would allow you to only, Georgetown would only do early voting in that one election, and it would be only the township. And then, the rest of the plan would be implemented like we've outlined here. So it is frightening, in my opinion, that the amount of flexibility. I mean, I'm all for local control. I believe in it. I think it's a underpinning of some of our real success, right, as a country and as a state. But I think when it comes to certain functions of the government, we need to have very just clear. The rules need to be very clear our voters and for the security of the process too.
The two things that are pretty, I think, inherent in what you said. The early voting locations would be closed on that Tuesday, the day of the vote.
Correct.
And then there's some way at those early voting locations of cross-referencing voter lists throughout the county. So if I'm in Holland shopping and I decide to vote there 7 days ahead, they've got to know it here that I couldn't show up in the precinct and vote again, right? So there's...
Correct. Yeah, and many of those building blocks of that system are already in place, and we already have that. We have a statewide voter database that's essentially in an environment that is a secure live environment right now. So, you know, like we were talking about earlier, if you're same-day registration, which was passed in 2018 as a part of the Constitution, if you're registering to vote on Election Day and you walk in here and you know, Amber or Ryan types in your information and they say, okay, Jim Wieringa, he lives here, he's got a matching ID. They would be able to see if you had actually tried to register down the street at another jurisdiction. So it's very similar to that live environment where we have to have that live environment in order for the integrity of the system. And that is what we see in other states as well. I mean, that's what other states are using for their early voting processes.
Justin, logistically, how does ballots work at a voting center? I'm just thinking, like, we try when we draw our precinct lines to make sure that we don't have people from two different school districts voting at the same precinct in case the school district has a millage or whatever. And I know that even something hyper local like precinct delegates, right? The ballot at my precinct and the ballot at John's would be different because of precinct delegates. When somebody walks into a voting center, do they just print that person's ballot on the spot for the person to use? How does that work?
Yeah, so yes, print on demand is really kind of an essential function of early voting because of that. So essentially what would happen, and you already have a voter profile in the electronic poll book in the voter system right now, the voter database, it says exactly which ballot you need. So not only does your voter profile say you live in precinct 2, but it says you're in the Hudsonville School District, you know, these are your representatives in Congress, you know, this is the ballot essentially that you need. So essentially, we have, our vendor, Hart InterCivic, has a process, a print-on-demand process where we use secure ballot paper. It's locked in a printer device, and the print-on-demand device essentially scans a barcode that is associated directly with your voter profile. So it's already on there now on the qualified voter file. So like if you get an absentee ballot, for example, that barcode prints out above your name.
Okay.
So we'd scan the barcode and it would populate immediately on a screen your ballot. That could then be printed and handed to the voter. But with that, we also have to have backups. So we can't allow, you know, the system to solely depend on a print-on-demand device. So the backup physically printed ballots would be available in a locked, secure cabinet as well, organized by precinct. And that's a really delicate part of the training, and a really crucial part of the training is giving the voter the right ballot.
Essentially having some sort of a file cabinet, right, that has our 23 municipalities, and then each municipality is different precincts. So you're pulling the right one. That's wild.
Yeah.
So in the past, absentee ballots, you were allowed to change your voting prior to Election Day. You still going to be able to do that with early voting?
So not with early voting, because, you know, the difference is you're actually placing the ballot in the tabulator and it's getting scanned by the voter. And I think what's interesting is we've been back and forth on this as a state for quite a while. I mean, I have my own opinions on the cost benefit of early voting, but I think as absentee ballot usage has become more ubiquitous, a lot of voters have said, well, I want to know that I want to be the one to put that ballot in. Like, I want to be there doing that. And so that early voting process gives the voters that opportunity, but with that opportunity comes the fact that you can't take that back once you've cast the ballot.
The 4 locations, is that mandated by state law, or is that, when it said the plan, is that a...
Yeah, it is not. So it's not mandated by state law. It's interesting. We've been talking with a couple colleagues. I have one colleague in Hillsdale County. Their county is doing countywide early voting in one location. They're a much smaller county. Saginaw County, they've got about 180,000 registered voters. They're doing one location for their process. We basically looked at data. Of course, we don't have any data for Michigan, but we looked at a lot of other states and how voter behavior looks when it comes to early voting. And typically in states where absentee ballots are common, it's about a third. So you've got a third of the population voting absentee, a third voting in the precinct, and then about a third voting using early voting. And so we broke down the county based on regions, based on voter turnout in 2020, which is a high benchmark, high watermark for total number of turnout, 169,910 voters. In that, I have spreadsheets. My wife thinks I'm going insane right now. I feel like the guy with all the Post-it notes on the wall. But basically, we took that data and looking at a third of the voter turnout in that high watermark election in the Georgetown region, in the Holland region, in the Grand Haven region, and so in the northern Ottawa County region. And that northern region, I think, is largely a convenience as well, because there's a lot of voters in Chester Township, right, that are not going to drive to Georgetown probably. I mean, they typically are driving to Grand Rapids for their, so we're trying to look at patterns of where people are traveling. Our Strategic Impact Office, I know some of you guys know Paul Sachs, who's been with the county for quite a while in Strategic Impact, and his team, they were really helpful with kind of modeling some of that. But it's based on population, convenient location, voter behavior, the best that we can sort of predict.
Right, because I look at it, Fillmore Complex is kind of the central point for everybody in Ottawa County.
Yeah.
Which it is set as the center. And when it came up in finance, I looked at it and said, so Georgetown's going to be burdened with extra traffic, the hassle, interruptions to our employees doing their normal daily work for 9 days, interruptions to meetings we're going to have, whether it be a zoning board of appeals or a
Planning Commission.
So I said, well, it must be the county's going to give us like a 50% discount on our contribution for the hassle we're going through.
And I will say this, I mean, this is a decision, that the securing of the location itself will be a decision of the board separate, right, from this contract, because this contract doesn't specify the location has to be here in the township. And, as Amber and I have talked over the past couple of weeks as we've looked at some of the modeling, I think this is a great location for a lot of things. I mean, we've been grateful. We utilized you guys last year for an event that we had. I mean, it's a great location, but it's also something we want to look at in terms of in February, I think it'd be fine. In August, probably fine. In a presidential election, I don't think this would be a location that we even could use based on the space and the constraints that you're talking about, right, where you've got kind of going into a building where your staff is. And so I think that's a legitimate issue, and I think that is something we want to make sure. We haven't inked any contracts with any locations. Well, we've had a lot of really positive conversations, and I'm ready to do that. We have a timeline where we need to do that. But I think your concerns are valid, and I would say, the baseline, the top highest possible daily turnout in a presidential election for a Georgetown Regional Vote Center is like 4,000 people a day. I don't know that you want 4,000 people a day.
The thing is you want to keep a site consistent. You're not going to want to have that site for the primary here and for an August primary, and then the president, let's move it to someplace different.
Correct.
I can tell you how upset, 65 to 80-year-old people are going to be. It's like,
right. Polling locations very often, but we see that around the county, right? When a polling location moves, it is not.
Oh yeah.
Not a.
That don't go well.
Good thing.
Yeah, and that's why I like the idea of just one. And I think that was talked about early on when before we voted on 22-2. what would the logistics be? Who would handle it? A lot of clerks and supervisors and board members said one location at the county, just to be decentralized. Because honestly, if somebody wants to vote early, they can drive to the Fillmore complex. It's need to be convenient because it's an inconvenience for everybody but the person who wants to go vote 9 days early.
And I will tell you right now, I mean, we are very, very open to hosting location. That is not something that we have turned down in the least. And I think if it makes regional sense, we're on board with doing that. We couldn't be the only location because of the numbers. So we would have approximately, based on all of our best estimates, based on what other states' behavior, voter patterns in other states, 10,000 people in a day, every day.
Cool.
So a third of our voters over that 9-day window would be a little under 10,000, I guess. But it would be more than what our one facility could handle in that case, too.
So it was, who were the two places looking at the one central location? Was it Saginaw? Did you say Saginaw?
Yeah, Saginaw County. And that's by far the largest county that's looking at as far as I know, like where they're at today. I think what's challenging is we're all sort of in this, because some of these things were just now decided, right? I mean, we were modeling our agreements based on legislation well before it was actually written, just to say, well, we think it's going to be this. We think it's going to be this. So I know a lot of us are in the planning process across the state right now, but the last I spoke with Saginaw, that was their plan.
And then as far as that distribution, if there is a reimbursement, who's deciding? Is that going to be legislature decides how it breaks down?
So that is the Secretary of State's office, essentially.
And is it going to be based on population or registered voters? I guess is my question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question.
It makes sense to be registered voters because it's not population. Because we know how this is going to shake out anyway. But
right, and I think I would agree. I would certainly hope so. In some level, like when you aggregate across the state, population and registered voters becomes roughly the same equation, if that makes sense, right? Because because our statewide number of voter registration is roughly in that same percentile. So we had the same thing when we were modeling, trying to cost model out for the county. We said, well, do we do it on population or do we do it on voter registration? But it basically ended up being close to the same percent.
And that's what I wondered too, because I think Georgetown has a higher registered voter and turnout than, say, where's the TCF Center again? TCF Center in Wayne County? Well, what's their turnout for an election? Do they hit 30%?
Yeah, that's a great question.
So, and that's what I'd like to see is the money distributed based on who's actually doing the work, not who's getting.
I amen to that. I mean, I fully agree, and I think that's one of the reasons why it is important to maintain relationships, and we are on a regular basis in contact with the leadership of the Secretary of State's office, including the Secretary, and I think we need to be able to advocate for what we need very vocally, and hopefully we can do that, because I think at some level it's got to be distributed equitably. They've got to have some sort of formula, and we're very anxious to see what that formula is, I think.
Well, Justin, thank you.
I've discussed a lot.
Just to mention, you've served us wonderfully for many, many years and always been very competent. Sounds like you're well on top of this, and we appreciate you working with our people. I think many of us are just worried about communities that border on being dysfunctional, and this sounds incredibly complicated. And we just hope and pray this is going to go well so it doesn't divide us. But it seems like you're on top of it.
It's a major challenge, and I think once the constitutional amendment passed, we sort of have to shift to say, well, how can we do this in a way that A is secure and B engenders public confidence in the process, because that's a big factor too. We want people to know that they can trust, here's what we can control, right? In Georgetown, you have, in Ottawa County, we want people to know that they can trust this process, so.
Oh, I did think of one other question. So we own our own, well, we're 50% owner of the equipment. So would the county be bringing in different tabulators, or will we be using Georgetown's tabulators?
So yeah, good question, and yeah, I apologize, I didn't bring up the tabulator issue. So the 50% split is actually on the maintenance agreements, the ongoing maintenance cost of the election equipment. So county pays 50, the township pays 50, but the county actually pays for all of the election equipment. So including, if you were to expand and say we need additional precincts, which I think has happened once, I want to say, since 2017, the county buys that tabulator, that additional equipment.
Because I didn't remember what the original agreement, I was thinking it was it in, what was that, 6 years ago?
Yeah,
5 years ago?
17.
Where we were 50-50, wasn't it? County, or is it all county purchased all equipment?
So it was 50-50, and I'd have to look specifically at the agreement, but the 50-50 portion was on the maintenance. So the ongoing preventative maintenance, the required scheduled maintenance on the election equipment.
Because it seems like back then, I thought didn't we pay like $250,000 for election equipment? Does that sound right? Georgetown's?
No, because I think the county itself, our total election equipment cost was around $1.2 million in 2017, and the state picked up a huge percentage of that as well then, because they had allocations separately for purchasing election equipment. But the equipment is under our insurance authority at the county level. It's funded, insured and funded through the county, and the 50% is on maintenance.
And I guess my concern was if we have increased townships coming using our equipment, putting wear and tear on them more than normal, and then it breaks and now we're in a 50-50 maintenance. Or do the other ones chip in to repair our equipment because they bring their own equipment?
And I guess that's one reason why it's important that the equipment is separate as well. So the equipment that's allocated to Georgetown Township is truly only used by Georgetown Township. There might be an exception, right, if we had an equipment failure during testing and we, brought out one of your tabulators and we replaced it temporarily with one of ours. We have backup equipment as well. But the equipment that's assigned to you under our maintenance agreement, all those serial numbers are documented. That's technically your allotment of equipment, even though we pay for it. With early voting, one of the huge cost saving pieces of this is the equipment. So if every single jurisdiction were to do early voting, that would add about $150,000 more just in equipment costs, because we have to have a separate piece of equipment for early voting.
Okay.
It's programmed separately, and then it has to be. So in other words, you couldn't use the tabulator here for early voting and then switch it over really quick on election day. Because one, it requires the public administration of a logic and accuracy test, and there's just no way that jurisdictions have the time to do that on the day before an election. But it also is programmed separately than the townships, right? Because it includes additional precincts on that tabulator, and it's in a different bucket. So bucket it will report as early voting results, absentee results, and election day results.
Same manufacturers, what do we have, ES&S right now, or Hart?
Yeah, Hart Intercivic. So it's the exact same manufacturer. We're under a 10-year contract with Hart and with the state of Michigan. So there were 3 approved election vendors. We went with Hart Intercivic back in 2017. So it would be the exact same equipment that voters are used to seeing here and countywide.
And then built-in wireless modems?
No built-in wireless modems, no modeming at all at this point. So that was a feature that we, as a county, moved off of following the 2020 election. I just felt strongly, and as we're having conversations around the country with colleagues, I sit on the U.S. Election Assistance Board, which is essentially a 100-member board, 2 members from each state, that looks at the voting system guidelines. The U.S. Election Assistance Commission was no longer going to certify modeming into the future, and we just made the decision as a county that we would like to cut those ties early and get out ahead of the game a little bit in terms of what our new procedure would be. And so what we have been doing in elections this year, I'm trying to remember, Georgetown was a part of that, yes, in 2023 in May. So we are using GPS units to track the results. So the physical data card, the encrypted data card that goes into the tabulator that contains essentially the ballot data is unsealed from the machine by the election workers on election night, is resealed into a secure container, and that, is signed off on by a Republican and a Democrat election inspector. And there's a GPS unit
Like AirTag.
in that bag that is, essentially an AirTag. So we have a dashboard of the county where we can see and track in real time where those results are. So if they're en route to our office, we know where they are. And so they were basically delivered by deputized staff in May on the election. I believe it was your deputy clerk here in Georgetown that brought them. Which was actually generous of you. But it was, so like all of us have, so we have these GPS monitors, and that's replacing the electronic transmission of the unofficial results.
Okay. Just want to make sure that the new machine, the early voting tabulators, did not have any.
So these ones won't even have.
But not the physical hardware is not in it. Just not just turned off. It's not in it.
Correct. And the physical hardware itself was removed from all those machines.
Oh, was it? Oh, good. Because people do ask questions like that.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. They do.
Just one more question. Just one more question. Because I know on here it says 4 sites. What if, like Amber and Rob said, well, maybe we only need 2 sites, or maybe we only, 3 sites? What if, is that negotiable, or is that just set in stone?
Yeah, it's another good question. So basically, the way the agreement is laid out is for 4, and it's a collaborative agreement that we really feel strongly will work best when all 23 of our local jurisdictions are together in this. And again, I think the reason for the 4 sites is mainly for the convenience of our voters, right? So if we were to go down to 2, where would those 2 be? Would you prefer they would be in Holland instead of Georgetown? I mean, so that would be the battle that we would have, right? That would be
Okay.
So we've sort of laid that out with the intentionality of saying, here's where I think we can get everyone's support. But it's a great question.
Would you be opposed though? Let's say City Hudsonville says we have a site that we could have open for 9 days or for all the elections. Would that be an opposition for us to say we're going to move to City Hudsonville?
No, I don't.
I'm just saying. I'm just throwing it out there because in my mind, I'm thinking of some sites that may be available in the city of Hudsonville that would be, in my brain going, hey, we could probably have all our early voting for the primaries, for the August, and it could be in one site. Like I have a concern of not moving it. I'm thinking, well, maybe we could work with City of Hudsonville, or
I would be very open to hearing those ideas, and I think the clerk task force that we've developed over the next several weeks is really going to be taking a hard look at exactly where those locations need to be. So I'd love to have that conversation because, I think that's totally reasonable. I mean, again, if there's a 30-day out clause to the agreement, right? And so I think there's high incentive for us to make sure that we are doing what we say we do in the agreement. But I think something like that is pretty reasonable between here and Hudsonville.
The agreement tonight we're going to vote on, though, does not lock in those sites? Is that what you're suggesting?
Correct. It
That's what I wanted to know.
to 4 sites, but does not lock in the actual site itself.
All right.
Good.
You did a great job explaining and answering questions. Frankly, I think we have probably the best clerk in the state, at least most capable. And I would that you couldn't organize and conduct it all across the state, right? I mean, charged with obviously physically impossible and not jurisdictionally feasible, but if things were run the way we expect you're going to have them run here elsewhere, I think that would be a good thing. It wouldn't cure the low information voter issue of giving 9 days and same day registration and putting places, polling boxes and so on here and there. It's still going to create a lot of low information voter turnout. But at least I think the way you're laying this out is going to be here in Ottawa County a secure process.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
Definitely. Could not do it without the support of our local jurisdictions, and we have some fantastic clerks and boards, and we're grateful to be where we're at, that's for sure.
Yep.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Justin.
Well, so we've got, and by the way, Justin, you're welcome to stay or go. We certainly don't begrudge you getting home to your family. So
Appreciate it, guys.
and you're welcome anytime. So we had this township agreement for the early voting services. He's just gone through that with the county. It doesn't lock in the various site locations. I know in Finance Committee we went through it, asked a number of questions. You've asked many more here tonight. And is there a motion to approve that agreement for early voting administrative services with Ottawa County? So moved.
Support.
All right. Is there further discussion among the board about that? I'm sure we're not excited, largely, I'll say. But as far as he's the messenger. He's not the guy who made the mandate. So, yeah. That happened in November.
For me, it ultimately comes down to cost.
Yeah.
And it was rolled out when we had our meeting on it. It would cost over $200,000 for us to do it on our own. To partner with him, it's $80,947 for 2 years. So it's economically better, as well as it adds another security level to it. So.
Yep.
And we wouldn't have that luxury in some counties. We wouldn't trust necessarily what they do at the clerk level. And so we appreciate that. Yeah. Good point, Ryan. Good point about money. Anybody else? It's a roll call vote, so.
Ms. Schwalm?
Yes.
Ms. Steele?
Yes.
Clerk is a yes. Supervisor?
Yes.
Treasurer?
Yes.
Mr. Belden?
Yes.
Ms. Graffman?
Yes.
All seven passed.
Thank you. Item number 10, this is an ordinance to change from rural residential to LDR, a parcel of land there on Bauer Road, 3405 Bauer. Is there a motion to approve that resolution as recommended by the Planning Commission?
So move.
Support it.
They move and support. This is a piece of property that's gone back and forth between LDR and RR and now back to LDR again. I guess they were going to put a single family home on it at one time and then they changed their minds, or maybe a new buyer came in and said they want to put condos. So it's been LDR approved by this board. It's been RR approved by this board again, and now potentially back to LDR. And the future land use planning map shows it as going LDR. So this comes from somebody who wants to limit some of the growth and development of the township, but I think this is, I think it meets the requirements, and they found as much through their staff report. Any thoughts? This board hasn't, but other boards have been asked the same question twice before. So, comments? This is a roll call vote, by the way. Yeah, all right. Go ahead.
Good?
Yep.
Ms. Graffman?
Yes.
Mr. Belden?
Yes.
Treasurer?
Yes.
Supervisor?
Yes.
Clerk is yes. Mrs. Steele?
Yes.
Ms. Schwalm?
Yes.
All seven.
All right, excellent. Item 11, 2024 budget draft presentation, and I'm going to turn it over here to Rob at this time. I know he sent us each a draft budget, and then earlier this week sent a revised draft budget with recognition that some vehicles were going to be purchased perhaps out of this year's budget. I believe that was the loan change. So, Bob, I turn it over to you. By the way, we've gone through this in Finance Committee. Not that we as Finance Committee members won't have more questions of our own, but those who were not part of that presentation probably not privy to some of the things that we went over, and they asked some of the same questions this evening.
Great, thank you. So just a reminder tonight, we're presenting the annual draft budget for 2024. September 11th, we can offer an amendment to the budget, tentatively adopt the budget because of public hearing for September 25th.
Hey, Rob, just to interrupt you for 1 second. I'm so sorry. I'm thinking of the quality of our video recording. Is there a way for us to toggle your microphone on? Because I'm not hearing you over microphone.
Test.
There it is. Thank you.
All right, I'll start over, Becky.
No, you don't need to start over. I just want us to have you forever.
All right, so tonight I'm presenting the manager's budget for 2024. Discussion, questions, and of course, any questions in the weeks leading up to September 11, where the board can offer any budget amendments, tentatively adopt the budget, and schedule a public hearing for September 25. On September 25 will be the public hearing, set the millage rate, and adopt the budget. And just want to talk about this budget for 24. Again, as last year, it's based on input from the various department heads, help from Justin, and still a little bit of help from Dan Carlton. So all of those things resulted in the appropriations budget for 2024. And I always like to point this out and remind folks that the municipal budget is not a forecast of the amount of money that we expect to spend. It is the maximum amount that management is allowed to spend. And there's a difference. This is not a mandate to spend. There are many items in appropriations that don't get spent, or they end up being higher amounts. This is our best projections and the legal right to spend to that maximum. For 2024, the total requested general fund appropriations is $16,917,147, so just about $17 million. This, assuming a millage rate of 2.25, which will be set officially on the 25th, whatever that rate is, these revenues are based on a 225. For information, the township taxable values show an increase of about 8.8% over last year, and our 23-24 SEV is about $2.3 billion. So that continues to grow. Important to note that this revenue budget assumes, and we still have ARPA funds to spend, assumes 3.5 in ARPA funds. I have the aerial truck again in 24. We don't expect it in 24, probably in 25, but in case it does arrive, we have the appropriations to pay for the aerial truck. And in this budget, this allocates 1/7 of ARPA to roads. So because we have to, by law, balance the appropriations budget, in order to do that, this assumes $1.7 million contribution from the fund balance. We don't expect that to happen, but that's the plug to make that a balanced appropriations budget. The water sewer fund, which is a separate fund, appropriations are almost $13.9 million. And with this, because I have increases to the water and sewer rates, this budget projects revenues to exceed expenditures by just over $1 million. I have an approximate 30% increase in there. The rate study, which we'll discuss in utilities, places it higher. Again, this is appropriations. So that's how those numbers were arrived at. In terms of major items by department, I have actually $70,000, $10,000 is actually some software agreements. But we have a situation here where we need help with IT services. We do not have a help desk. We do not have IT services. So I have appropriated $70,000 for IT managed services, if that comes to be. And again, these items, anything over $10,000 has not been approved, has not been bid out. These are projections, and all of these projects must be approved item by item. We also have, based on our network audit from Raymond, a discussion about having a backup server in case our main server goes down. If we did go that route, I have $50,000 appropriated in the budget for that. There's $175,000 in HVAC controls. We have issues with HVAC in this building in terms of controlling the cooling and the heat. We have a rough number, again, a rough number just for appropriations of $175,000. And then I have in here $110,000 appropriated for carpet in the township building. The carpet's over 25 years old if the board decides to go down that road.
And then you'll see, department by department, again, the way some of these big items like the HVAC controls and the carpet, just for accounting, we spread them across departments. So that's why assessing shows 30,000. There should be a zero there. 250 in HVAC, 19,000 in carpet. Elections budget appropriations is way up. It's easier on the eyes if you compare that to 22 versus 23. We have 4 elections in 2024. We have 9 days early voting. We have all sorts of expenses in there. We shared those detailed budget items with Ryan Kidd. So there's large expenditure appropriations increases for elections in 24. The sheriff's budget, we have figures. I have the number, which is exceeding 2.3 for next year's contract. That's the minimum. That's just based on their current projected cost, but they're also negotiations. So that number is going to be higher than that, which is why I have 2.4 appropriated for the same contract level for deputies in 2024. With the fire department, again, the aerial truck is there. If it comes in 24, then we'll use that money. If not, that'll get pushed to 2025. There's $90,000 appropriated for dress uniforms for our entire staff. $25,000 for replacement turnout gear for those that need replacement. As you may recall, we purchased $300,000 of brand new turnout gear that just arrived, right, Chief?
It just arrived.
The second time around? Yes. The first time they got the wrong color, but it's all worked out. $80,000 appropriated for various fire equipment. We have station HVAC issues at 2 of our stations, so there's dollars appropriated. HVAC carpet, since they do share some office space here, and that could change. And then we have some station security control upgrades or replacement that we may have to do, and that is appropriated. Nothing new with building zoning. Cemetery, we have a 1 point FTE add for the cemetery. We need to start repairing those roads in the cemetery, and the $75,000 is the current plan is to work the west section of the cemetery. $40,000 in just historical costs. What normally happens in the cemetery, there's a request to add another columbarium at $15,000, and then a $25,000 capital outlay placeholder if items come up. Senior transportation will be purchasing a van for $60,000, and the good news there, that'll be covered fully by a transportation grant, but we need to show the expense as well. Senior center has dollars allocated for parking lot repairs. We have a leaking roof that we are working actually with Lakewood on, who constructed the building, and we had them over there, I think, recently. No, we did have them over there recently, looking at that. So there may or may not be costs involved there. There's a telephone server that needs to be replaced and some security replacements in there. The parks budget, which shows some large appropriations, and I stress appropriations, not commitments or decisions. But to plan for that, the numbers need to go in there. So there's $850,000 for pickleball courts. There's $200,000 in Rush Creek playground equipment. Tennis courts at Maplewood for $115,000. Park signs, which are made of wood and falling apart, at $90,000. Maplewood basketball court at $30,000. Rush Creek tennis courts at $30,000. We need new plow and blades for our parks and cemetery guys, and there's a $25,000 placeholder. Library, they tend to have $70,000 to $85,000 historical costs a year. Again, if they don't occur, we don't spend it. And then there's a $23,000 placeholder for various items. DPW, water and sewer, again, the separate fund has 2 FTE adds. And we have 1.6 million allocated to meters, registers, and endpoints. We had a large appropriation in the current budget, but because we can't get them, that money is not being spent yet. Engineering, $100,000 for various projects. $750,000 for the numerous repairs to the water and sewer infrastructure. With the 48th Street water main, the dollars that will be needed in '24 are estimated at $3.4 million. And we need another generator as backup in case lift stations or pump stations fail, that we have the ability to allow people to run water and flush their toilets. And then there's their portion of HVAC and carpet. And for safety concerns for our workers, we're looking to add another message board, arrow board, when they're on the road working for $25,000. And then there's a $100,000 placeholder for various capital items. So I'll take questions. If you have any questions over the next couple weeks, send me an email and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. This is essentially, if you compare it to the '23 budget, a 9.9 increase to revenues and expenditures, again balanced, so they're both 9.9. It's about a 4.8% increase in expenditures to water sewer from the '23 budget. And we do expect this year to, both in general fund and water sewer, add to both fund balances.
So how did elections go up that much?
4 elections, 9 days early voting. What else, Amber? Equipment.
We've got the mailing expenses.
Posted, yep.
4 elections. We've got all of the workers for all 4 elections, which is going to count all 17 precincts and all 8 counting boards. We've got more receiving boards that we're going to have to pay for, because again, we're going to have all of the precincts for all of those. We have to replace for all of them, all of the precincts for each of the elections, even though we may not need all of them for May. Depends on who has what. But we have to account that we do have all of those for that May election.
Receiving boards would be different this time as opposed to 2 years ago because... So it's the same. So essentially the only thing that's changing is the 9 days early voting on 3 of the elections. And that's, I forget, what's our portion again? Anybody remember? I think 180,000? I don't remember.
And another election, another 4th election.
80.
But I can
The
send
4th
you,
election is strictly school, so school reimburses us 100%.
right. We have to show the
3
expense.
elections.
Postage
net it.
too, right? We have to pay postage for absentee, right? And pay the return postage only.
Which is the same as previous years.
Gone up significantly from previous years, so yes.
So even if it's offset by reimbursement, we have to show the appropriation or the expense.
The February election should be reimbursed by the Republican and Democratic parties, and the May elections should be reimbursed by the schools that have to.
I'm just looking at 2020, which was $260,000. And then 22, which was another bigger one, 339. And then, so going from 2020 at 260,000 to 24 at 697,000, that's a jump.
It's a big jump.
Real big jump. So library, 85,000, historical repairs. Isn't that 3, is it 3 years old now?
4, I think. Yeah.
4. What kind of repairs are we talking there at 85,000?
Whatever comes up. That's what that means.
And are we following up, which is, I guess, part of my next question, which is the senior center. So we did contact Lakewood Construction, which I thought, what is 15-year warranty on the roof?
They said 1. They're going to look at the install, look at the architect's designs and how what was required for the install and materials, and in case there's a defect in the warranty. So I met them there today. We have a plan B if it's not covered, so we need to fix.
Oh, well, most definitely.
So in terms of the library, Mike, in 2022, we had 74,000 repairs and maintenance actual expense. This year so far, or through 6 to 7 months, we're at 57,000. So it's miscellaneous repairs. What have we had since you're here? I know prior to you, we've had a couple of roof issues, stuff that has to be fixed. So that's the appropriation in case those things come up. If nothing breaks, we don't spend it.
Seems like we're getting some, for being brand new stuff, it's just not holding up very well. I think typically roofs are 15-year warranty commercial, aren't they? I mean, have you ever heard anything less than a 15-year commercial? Usually like 20.
Depends what's leaking. Could be rubber, could be steel. I don't know.
Well, that's why they call it Lakewood.
Yeah.
It's time to try somebody else. Let's see. Generator, 125,000. Is that a portable generator, like a tow behind, or is that a fixed?
Joel?
Natural gas. Portable. Jeez, those are expensive. And currently we have 2.
As I say, we had a chance to ask a number of these questions ourselves in finance. Anybody who's just heard it for the first time tonight or read it this week and heard Rob's explanation wants to ask a question?
Well done.
Not obviously approving it tonight, but we're...
Rob, I
This
so
is
appreciate
today.
the time that you and that our staff has put into putting this together. This document that you just went through, this summary, is amazing. Has that been shared with us? And I just haven't.
It's shared with you in the notes from that budget detail. I thought up here, and we can send you this as well. So it's in the notes, but I thought as I read it, you could follow along more easily. So we'll send you that.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Big water and sewer, 2 full-time. What's the total of full-time employees that are going to be added in the next year? How many?
3?
3. And we added
3
how
or
many?
4?
How many added in the last 6 months or 8 months?
0 or 1?
I don't think we've added anybody, have we?
0 or 1? 0.
I don't think we've added anybody.
Thought we had an extra parks guy.
No. No.
I can never remember his name. Really nice kid.
Who's kid?
Parks guy. He's pretty tall. He might have been a replacement.
Park attendant?
The parks guy. I think he's a younger guy, pretty tall.
We have the seasonal folks.
Ethan.
I'm glad you're right-sizing staff. It's overdue.
Is it?
And please, any questions in the next couple of weeks, send me an email.
Yes, I
Well
will.
done. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rob.
Back to our agenda then. So it's been presented. There's no motion that needs to come out of that. At this point, you've got your dates coming up in September and October and eventual adoption of a budget. So item number 12, second public comment period. Does anyone here this evening wish to address the board on any topic before we close? Okay, seeing none, I'll close that public comment period. Item 13, discussion and general information among the board. Any board members wish to bring up a matter, discussion among us at this time? All right, hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
Move.
Support.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
And adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.